Okay, in this video, we want to talk about dynamic routes and URL parameters. So when we click on these posts titles, we want to see the detailed page. Let's just start by creating a dynamic URL. In our app folder and then posts, I'm going to create a new folder. I would call this show. And then within that, I will have another folder, which I would call it ID. And inside the ID folder, I will have my page.jsx. And in here, we want to create our React component. So let's say export default function. I would call this show, and I would simply return the p tag that says show. So very simple. Now, if we go back to our website and go to /posts and then show and then ID, then we can see that component. Now, of course, this ID is a hard-coded text and we want to make this dynamic. We want to, for example, make this into a number or whatever. Right now, it is giving us a 404 because it assumes we have a folder with this name. In order to make a route dynamic, all we have to do is to wrap the folder name with brackets. In this case, we want to wrap this ID with brackets. So now it's /show/ID, but this ID is in brackets, meaning the value of it could be anything. Right now we have a number up here, but if I change it to anything else, we would still see that component because now this is dynamic. And that is how you can create dynamic routes in Next.js, by wrapping the folder name in brackets. Now the next step is to actually grab that ID or URL parameters in our component, in this case, in the show component. And this is quite simple with Next.js. All we have to do is to accept params in our component. So notice the curly brackets and then the word params. Now, if we simply log that into the console, you notice this is returning a promise. So we want to await for the result of these params. Let's make our function async. And before logging that, let's say const URL params, for example, and we will set this to await params. So this property up here. And now let's log URL params into the console. And here we have an object where the key is ID, and that is the folder name we defined in our application, and the value is coming from the URL. So if we change this to anything, then we get the ID, which has the value of this URL parameter. And that's how we can access the URL parameters, just by accepting this params property as a parameter in our component. And instead of grabbing all the params, we can just extract the parameters we want. So in this case, we only want the ID, so we can extract that and then log that to the console. So this will give us the value, and this will be the post ID. And based on that ID, we will query our database to show the proper results. So let's do this. We don't need this log anymore. Let's delete this. And first, we want to grab our posts collection. So I will create a variable and I will set this to await get collection. And it expects a collection's name. So I will say posts and make sure it is imported. Then I will create my post variable. So this would be that individual post, and I want to query my database. So again, I can say await posts collection and find one from this collection using the find one method. This will take an object, and that is going to be our criteria. So we want to search or query our database based on the ID. And we know in MongoDB, the ID property starts with an underscore. So we want the ID to be this ID up here. However, this ID is going to be a string, and this ID in MongoDB is an object ID. It's not just a string. So we want to turn this into an object ID. So let's import object ID from MongoDB. Then we want to create a hex string from our ID, which is coming from the URL parameters. Now, if this is successful, we will have a post, and then we can render some markup for that. And to keep this simple, I'm just going to use our post card, the same component we used on the homepage. Before that, let's return a div with the class container. Also set the width to half. And in here, we will import our post card. This is expecting a post prop, and we already have it up here. So we can just say post in curly brackets. And that is most of the work, and also assuming that all of these properties and variables are correct. So we need to check a few things before actually get to this postcard. Right now, if we go back to our website, you notice we have an error because we are trying to create an object ID from a string with only 3 characters, and that is throwing an error. So we can check if this ID has 24 characters, then we can use this function. Otherwise, we don't want to do that, and we want to return null, for example. So we can either use an if-else statement, or we can just turn this into a ternary operator. I can say check for the ID length and see if that is 24 characters, then query our database. Otherwise, just return null or set this post to null. So doing this will solve one problem. Now going back to the website, we have a different error because we are trying to read properties of null. So again, we want to have another check in our markup. So let's wrap this with curly brackets and start by saying if post was true, then render this postcard. Otherwise, let's just have a p tag that says failed to fetch the data. So this is our markup based on post, and this is our actual post based on the ID. And we need to add one more check, that is right here. We are assuming that the database connection is successful, but if it is not successful, then we will get another error even if we have a 24-character string. We can simply add a question mark here and say if the database connection was successful, then find our post. Otherwise, again, it's going to be null. Back to our website, we can see the error message that there is no post with this ID. So if I add anything here that is not a proper ID, we will see this message. Now let's go back to our home page and then the postcard to link these titles to that show page. So let's open our postcard component, and right here we have a link and the href, which is empty at the moment. We want to link this to the show component. Let's add the curly brackets and the backticks, then add /posts /show and / the ID. So we will add this in $ curly brackets. We can say post._ID, and we want to turn this into a string using the toString method. And that is something to add to our postcard component. Back to the home page, if we go to Mike's post, there we go. We can see the show page. Going back to another post, there we have it, and you can see the ID up here. So again, if I change one of these characters to something else, that means we still have a 24 character, but that ID doesn't exist. So we will see the failed message. So this was quite simple, and we learned how we can create dynamic routes by wrapping the folder name with brackets and also grabbing the URL parameters using the params property that we can accept in our component. Now in the next video, we will talk about loading in suspense and see how we can create a waiting UI.